In medieval Poland, winter was not a season, it was a trial. Snow arrived early, darkness lingered, and fresh food vanished for months at a time. Fields slept, roads disappeared, and hunger crept quietly into homes. In that long silence of cold and waiting, fermented cabbage was not a side dish. It was the thin line between endurance and collapse, between life carried forward and life slowly fading. In medieval Poland, winter was the dominant force shaping everyday survival. It arrived earlier than expected and often lingered well into spring, stretching far beyond what stored grain alone could sustain. Temperatures dropped sharply, daylight shortened, and snow covered roads, fields, and villages for months at a time. Trade slowed or stopped completely, as carts could no longer pass and rivers froze solid. For rural communities, this isolation meant that whatever food had not already been preserved before the first heavy frost was simply lost. Fresh vegetables vanished first. Gardens lay dormant under frozen soil, and livestock slaughtered in autumn could not supply balanced nutrition throughout the entire winter. Illness spread easily in cramped, cold interiors, especially when diets narrowed to bread and thin porridge. Hunger was not always sudden or dramatic, it was gradual, weakening bodies day by day. In this environment, survival was not decided by wealth or abundance, but by preparation. Families who failed to plan for winter faced exhaustion, sickness, and, in severe years, death. Winter was not merely cold, it was a long test of endurance, patience, and foresight that defined medieval life in Poland. Cabbage played a crucial role in answering this seasonal challenge, because it was uniquely suited to the Polish climate. Unlike more delicate vegetables, cabbage thrived in short-growing seasons and tolerated cool temperatures remarkably well. It could withstand early frost that destroyed other crops, allowing peasants to harvest it late in the year when food options were already shrinking. This resilience made cabbage a reliable foundation of medieval gardens. Equally important was its productivity. A small plot of land could yield large, dense heads capable of feeding an entire household. For peasant families with limited acreage and labour, this efficiency mattered deeply. Cabbage required no specialised tools or advanced knowledge, only patience and basic care. Seeds were saved from year to year, reducing dependence on markets or external supplies. Because it was cheap, dependable, and adaptable, cabbage became accessible to nearly everyone, from poor rural families to monasteries and small towns. It did not promise luxury, but it offered consistency. In a world shaped by unpredictable weather and fragile harvests, cabbage represented stability, an everyday crop that quietly prepared communities for the long months when nothing else would grow. Fermentation offered medieval Polish households a preservation method perfectly adapted to scarcity. Unlike drying or smoking, it required no constant firewood, an expensive and limited resource during long winters. Wood was needed for heating, cooking, and basic survival. Wasting it on preservation could endanger an entire household. Fermentation solved this problem quietly, using time instead of fuel. Salt, though necessary, was used efficiently. Large quantities were not required, and once the process began, nature completed the work. Cabbage was shredded, lightly salted, and packed tightly into wooden barrels. Pressure and the absence of air created an environment where beneficial bacteria could thrive, preserving the food safely for months. These barrels effectively replaced smokehouses and ovens, transforming cellars and barns into living storage spaces. Most importantly, fermentation demanded no ongoing labour. Once sealed, the cabbage required little attention, freeing families to focus on other winter tasks. There was no risk of burning, freezing solid, or spoiling quickly. In a season defined by limited daylight and constant cold, this low-effort preservation method reduced daily strain. Fermentation was not a technological marvel, it was a practical answer to real constraints, turning simple cabbage into a stable food source without consuming the very resources needed to survive winter itself. Fermented cabbage was more than preserved calories. It was a vital source of nutrition during months when diets became dangerously narrow. Unlike cooked or dried vegetables, fermentation helped retain essential vitamins, particularly those that prevented weakness and seasonal illness. When fresh foods disappeared, this living food filled a critical gap that bread and grain alone could not cover. During winter, bodies weakened faster. Cold increased energy demands, while limited diets reduced resilience. Fermented cabbage provided acidity, minerals, and easily digestible nutrients that supported immune strength. It helped prevent fatigue, recurring sickness, and the slow decline that often followed prolonged malnutrition. for children, elders, and those already weakened and lessened by labour or illness. This difference could be life-saving. Equally important was how the body processed fermented foods. In cold conditions, heavy meals were difficult to digest, yet energy was desperately needed. Fermented cabbage struck a balance. It was light, warming, and sustaining without overwhelming the stomach. Added to soups, grains, or eaten alone, it brought both nourishment and comfort. In a season where survival depended on small advantages, fermented cabbage quietly protected health, proving that winter endurance relied not only on stored food, but on the right kind of food. In medieval Poland, fermented cabbage was not hidden away for emergencies. It was eaten every day, woven into ordinary meals rather than reserved for moments of crisis. This daily use was crucial. Winter diets were repetitive and limited, often centred on bread, grain porridge, and thin soups. Fermented cabbage brought variation, acidity, and substance to these simple foods, preventing meals from becoming nutritionally and psychologically exhausting. It was added to stews with grains, mixed into broths, or eaten alongside coarse bread. Because it was already preserved and softened through fermentation, it required little additional cooking, another advantage when fuel was scarce. Its sharp taste awakened appetite during long winters when hunger and fatigue dulled the senses. Eating it regularly helped maintain strength over months, not just during periods of extreme scarcity. By functioning as a daily staple rather than an emergency ration, fermented cabbage stabilized winter life. Families could plan meals around it with confidence, knowing that a dependable source of nourishment was always available. This consistency mattered deeply in a season defined by uncertainty. Survival was not only about having food stored away, but about having something reliable to eat every single day. Fermented cabbage filled that role quietly, turning endurance into routine rather than desperation. Winter did not bring rest to medieval households. While fields lay dormant, labour shifted indoors, repairing tools, weaving, caring for animals, and processing food. These tasks demanded steady energy, even as cold drained the body faster than in warmer seasons. Fermented cabbage suited this rhythm of work. It was easy to digest, allowing the body to absorb nutrients without the heaviness caused by dense or overly rich foods. In cold conditions, digestion slowed, and heavy meals often led to discomfort rather than strength. Fermented cabbage provided warmth and sustenance without burdening the stomach. Its natural acidity stimulated digestion, helping the body make better use of limited winter diets. This was especially important for those working long hours in poorly heated spaces. Combined with grains or legumes, fermented cabbage created balanced meals that sustained effort rather than causing fatigue. It did not create sudden bursts of energy, but steady endurance, exactly what winter labour required. In this way, fermented cabbage supported the survival not only by existing in storage, but by matching the physical demands of winter life. It fed work, movement, and persistence when every day required quiet resilience. Space was a constant limitation in medieval Polish households. Homes were modest, storage rooms few, and every corner had to serve multiple purposes. Fermented cabbage fit naturally into this reality. Stored in sturdy wooden barrels, it required no large facilities, no special structures, and no constant attention. Cellars, barns, or even shaded corners of a house were enough to keep it safe through the winter months. The barrels themselves offered protection. Packed tightly, the cabbage resisted spoilage and was less likely to freeze solid than many other foods. Even during severe cold, the fermentation environment remained stable. This reliability reduced anxiety in a season when food loss could mean disaster. Families did not need to check it daily or guard it closely. Once prepared, it simply endured. Because it lasted for the entire winter, fermented cabbage allowed households to manage their limited storage efficiently. Grain sacks, dried legumes, and root vegetables could be arranged around it without competition for space. This quiet practicality mattered deeply. Survival was not only about what food was preserved, but how easily it could be kept. Fermented cabbage respected the limits of medieval homes, offering nourishment without demanding room, resources, or constant vigilance. Fermentation was rarely a solitary act. In medieval Poland, the preparation of fermented cabbage was a communal ritual tied to the rhythm of autumn. Families gathered to harvest, shred, salt, and pack cabbage together before the cold fully arrived. This shared labour ensured speed and efficiency, but it also strengthened social bonds at a moment when cooperation mattered most. Knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation. Children learned by watching, elders guided the process, and mistakes were corrected through memory rather than written instruction. These practices were not recorded in books, yet they survived centuries because they worked. Fermented cabbage became part of cultural identity, tied to seasonal markers and collective experience. In times of hardship, this shared knowledge reduced vulnerability. No single household carried the burden alone. Neighbours exchanged advice, barrels, and sometimes food itself. Fermentation created a sense of continuity. Each winter echoed the last, and each preparation promised endurance ahead. In this way, fermented cabbage was more than nourishment. It was a living tradition, reinforcing community resilience and reminding people that survival was rarely achieved alone, but built together through shared effort and remembered wisdom. Without fermented cabbage, winter in medieval Poland became far more dangerous. Diets collapsed quickly when preserved vegetables were absent. Bread and grain alone could not sustain health over many months, especially in cold conditions where the body burned more energy simply to stay warm. Weakness appeared gradually, followed by recurring illness that spread easily within cramped households. What began as hunger often ended as exhaustion or disease. Fresh food did not return till late spring, and there was no reliable alternative once stored vegetables ran out. Meat was limited and expensive to preserve, and root crops alone could not provide balanced nutrition. In years when fermentation failed or was skipped, communities suffered visibly. Productivity declined, children weakened, and elders were especially vulnerable. Winter became not just uncomfortable, but unstable. Fermentation acted as a stabilizing force. It slowed physical decline and reduced the seasonal shock that winter imposed on the body. By ensuring a consistent, digestible food source, fermented cabbage prevented minor shortages from turning into full crises. Survival depended not on dramatic abundance, but on avoiding collapse. In this sense, fermentation did not merely preserve food, it preserved resilience. It held communities together through the most dangerous months, turning winter from a season of risk into one of endurance. Fermented cabbage did not make medieval life comfortable, it made it possible. In the harsh winters of Poland, survival rested on quiet preparation rather than abundance or innovation. Families endured not because they had more, but because they understood how to use what they had wisely. Fermentation represented patience, foresight, and respect for natural processes that worked slowly but reliably. From a modern perspective, this story offers a powerful lesson. Long before refrigeration, supplements, or global trade, people relied on simple methods refined through experience and shared knowledge. Fermented cabbage was not a shortcut. It was a commitment made months before winter arrived. It required trust in time and in collective memory. Today, speed and convenience often dominate how we think about food and preparation. Medieval fermentation reminds us that resilience is built in advance, not in moments of crisis. Waiting, planning, and preserving may seem modest, but they create stability when conditions turn harsh. The quiet endurance of fermented cabbage teaches us that survival is rarely dramatic. More often it is shaped by small, thoughtful choices made long before the cold sets in.